3,000 years of humans trying to figure out how to live a history of ideas through literature. Introductions. 3,000 years ago, a man sat down, or more likely stood, or paced, or lay under a tree, and began to compose a poem about a soldier trying to get home from a war. The poem would take the soldier 10 years to reach an island in the Mediterranean. Along the way, he would encounter gods, monsters, the dead, and the temptation to stop being himself. The poem was the Odyssey. The man was Homer, or the tradition we call Homer. And the question the poem asked, how should a person live, is the same question that every great work of literature has been asking ever since. Tonight, I want to trace that question through 3 millennia of writing. Not as a survey. I'm going to skip more than I include. And the choices are personal, not canonical, but as a journey through the books that have shaped how I think about the question. Books that sit on my shelves that I've carried across 4 countries, that I've read and reread at different stages of my life and found different answers in each time. We'll start with Homer and end with David Foster Wallace. Along the way, we'll pass through Plato and Plutarch, Marcus Aurelius and Dante, Montaigne and Shakespeare, Cervantes and Dostoevsky, Tolstoy and Woolf, Kafka and Faulkner, Borges and McCarthy. Every one of these writers tried to answer the question of how to live. None of them succeeded completely. All of them left us something we can't do without. This is a long journey. Settle in. Fall asleep if you need to. The books will be here when you wake up. Part 1. The Ancient World. Homer and the Odyssey. The Odyssey is the first great story about the difficulty of going home. Odysseus has fought at Troy for 10 years. He has been brave, clever, ruthless, and now he wants to go back to Ithaca, to his wife Penelope, to his son Telemachus, to the life he had before the war. But the journey home takes another 10 years. Poseidon, the sea god, is angry with him. Odysseus encounters the Cyclops, the Lotus Eaters, the Sirens, Circe, who turns his men into pigs, Calypso, who offers him immortality if he'll stay with her. Every episode is a test, not of strength, though strength matters, but of identity. Can Odysseus remain Odysseus? Can he remember who he is, what he wants, where he belongs, when the world keeps offering him reasons to forget? This is the original human question, and it hasn't changed. How do you remain yourself when the world keeps trying to turn you into something else? How do you get home when you can't remember what home was? I have lived in 4 countries. I have reinvented myself in each one. Different language, different culture, different version of Jake, and every time, somewhere underneath the adaptation, there was the question Odysseus asked, am I still the person who left? I own Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, which is the first translation by a woman, and it reads differently from every translation that came before it. Wilson's Odysseus is not a hero in the chest-thumping sense. He is a complicated man. That's her opening line. Not man of many wiles or resourceful Odysseus, but a complicated man. Oh, and that complication is, I think, the beginning of literature. The moment when a storyteller says, the person I'm describing is not simple. You will not fully understand him, but you will recognize him. Plato and the examined life. Plato's dialogues are the foundation of Western philosophy, but they are also, and more importantly, works of literature. Socrates, Plato's teacher, and the central figure of the dialogues, doesn't lecture. He asks questions. He engages people in conversation. He is funny, irritating, relentless, and genuinely curious And the method of the dialogue, two or more people searching for truth through conversation, testing every assumption, following every argument to its conclusion, is itself an answer to the question of how to live. You live by examining. That's Socrates' answer. The unexamined life is not worth living. Not because examination produces happiness. Socrates was sentenced to death for his examining, but because the alternative is worse. The alternative is living according to assumptions you've never tested, beliefs you've never questioned, values you've absorbed from your culture without ever asking whether they're true. I named my channel The Examine Shelf. It's a play on Socrates, obviously, but it's also a description of what I do. I take the books on my shelf and I examine them. I ask what they're really saying. I test their assumptions against my experience, and I invite you to do the same. This is Socrates' gift to the world, not a set of answers, but a method, a way of approaching every question, every book, every experience with the discipline of someone who refuses to accept the easy version. I own the complete works of Plato, a thick, heavy volume that I bought in college and that has followed me through every move. I don't read it often, but when I do, I'm always struck by the same thing: how alive these conversations feel. 2,400 years old. And Socrates still sounds like the smartest person in the room, still sounds like the person you'd most want to have dinner with and most want to avoid, because dinner with Socrates means having every comfortable belief dismantled before dessert. Plutarch's Lives. Plutarch's Parallel Lives is one of the most influential books ever written and one of the least read today. It consists of paired biographies, a Greek figure and a Roman figure, placed side by side for comparison. Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, Demosthenes and Cicero, Theseus and Romulus. The method is comparison, and the purpose is moral instruction. By studying how great men lived, their virtues, their vices, the choices they made under pressure, the reader learns something about how to live. I own both volumes of Plutarch's Lives, the old Chandos Classics editions with the leather spines and the gold tooling. They are beautiful objects, and they contain some of the most useful wisdom about leadership and character that I have ever encountered. Plutarch understood that character is not an abstraction. It's what you do when the decision is hard. It's how you behave when no one is watching. It's the accumulated weight of 1,000 small choices that gradually shape you into the person you are. Shakespeare read Plutarch. So did Montaigne. So did the founding fathers of the United States. Hamilton and Jefferson and Adams all read Plutarch's Lives and modeled their understanding of civic virtue on what they found there. The book has been shaping leaders for 2,000 years, and it still works because the problems of leadership haven't changed. How do you use power without being corrupted by it? How do you serve the public good when the public good conflicts with your own interest? How do you face death? These are Plutarch's questions. They are also the questions I face in smaller form every day. Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 AD. He was, by most accounts, a good emperor, conscientious, just, devoted to duty. He spent much of his reign fighting wars he didn't want to fight, managing crises he didn't create, and trying to hold together an empire that was beginning to crack. And at night, in his tent on the frontier, he wrote a private journal. He never intended it to be published. It has no title. We call it Meditations, but that's a later invention. It's a series of notes to himself reminders of how to think and how to behave drawn from the Stoic philosophy he had studied all his life. The core of Marcus Aurelius' teaching is this: you cannot control what happens to you. You can only control how you respond. External events, war, illness, betrayal, death, are beyond your power. Your judgments about those events are not. And the quality of your life is determined not by what happens, but by how you interpret what happens. I keep Meditations on my shelf next to the Daily Stoic and Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life. I've read Marcus Aurelius on planes, in hotels, in hospital waiting rooms, in moments when the world felt out of control and I needed something to hold on to. His voice is calm, steady, unadorned. He doesn't try to inspire you. He tries to steady you. And that's what the Stoics offered. Not happiness, not transcendence, but steadiness, the ability to face whatever comes without being destroyed by it. But Marcus Aurelius also understood the limits of Stoicism, that there are passages in the Meditations where, his composure slips, where you can feel the exhaustion and the grief underneath the philosophy. He was a man who lost children, who fought wars, who watched his empire decline, and the Stoic framework helped him endure, but it didn't make the endurance painless. And there is something deeply moving about a man who writes, "Do not be distressed, do not be dismayed," to himself over and over as if he's trying to believe it. Part 2, the medieval and Renaissance mind, Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy between 1308 and 1321. While he was in political exile from his native Florence, he would never return. The poem is his revenge, his theology, his autobiography, and the greatest single work of imagination in the Western tradition. The structure is famous. Dante, lost in a dark wood at the midpoint of his life, is guided through a hell, purgatory, and paradise. His guide through hell and purgatory is Virgil, the Roman poet. His guide through paradise is Beatrice, the woman Dante loved from a distance all his life. The Inferno is the part everyone reads because hell is dramatic and punishment is fascinating. But the real power of the comedy is in its architecture. Dante built a universe. Every sin has its place. Every virtue has its reward. Every soul has been weighed and measured and assigned to a location in a cosmic moral order that is as intricate and beautiful as a Gothic cathedral. And the journey through this order is also a journey through the self, through the fears, the desires, the attachments, the illusions that keep us from seeing clearly. The midpoint of Dante's life, he was 35 when the poem begins, and the medieval lifespan was 70, is when the questions that had been dormant become urgent. I read Dante for the first time in my late 30s, and the dark wood felt personal. Not literally. I wasn't in exile. I wasn't lost in a forest. But the sense of having reached the middle of something and not knowing what it was for, of having followed a path and suddenly realizing you can't see where it leads, that was real. Dante's genius was to take that universal middle-of-life confusion and give it a structure. He said, "Yes, you are lost. Now let me show you the territory." Montaigne's essays. Michel de Montaigne retired from public life in 1571 at the age of 38 and locked himself in a tower room in his castle in southwestern France. On the walls, he had inscribed quotations from his favorite classical authors. On the beams of the ceiling, he had painted maxims. And in this room, surrounded by his books and his inscriptions, he began to write. What he wrote was a new kind of literature. He called them essays. Attempts, trials, experiments. They were not treatises or arguments or narratives. They were a man thinking on the page, thinking about death, about friendship, about cannibals, about thumbs, about education, about the fact that his cat might be playing with him rather than the other way around. The subjects were various and apparently random, but the real subject was always the same. Michel de Montaigne, trying to understand himself. Montaigne's great discovery was that self-knowledge is not a destination. It's a practice. You don't arrive at understanding yourself. You keep trying, keep examining, keep writing, and the self keeps changing. And the understanding you achieved yesterday is no longer quite accurate today. This is not a failure. It's the condition. The self is not fixed. It moves. And the essay, the attempt, is the form that most honestly reflects this movement. I think about Montaigne constantly. His method is my method. Every video I make is an essay in Montaigne's sense, an attempt to understand something by thinking about it out loud. Not a lecture from a position of authority, but an exploration from a position of honest uncertainty. Montaigne gave us permission to not know, to say, I'm not sure, but here's what I think today, and I'll probably think differently tomorrow. That permission is one of the most valuable gifts in the history of literature. Shakespeare. I don't want to say too much about Shakespeare because everything has already been said, and because the best thing about Shakespeare is the experience of reading or watching him, which no commentary can replace. But there are a few things I want to note in the context of this journey through the question of how to live. Shakespeare is the writer who most completely understood that the question has no single answer. His plays contain multitudes. Hamlet says one thing, Falstaff says the opposite, and Shakespeare agrees with both. This is not relativism, it's something rarer. The capacity to hold contradictory truths in mind simultaneously and to find each of them compelling. Shakespeare understood that a person can be brave and cowardly, generous and selfish, wise and foolish, all in the same afternoon. And he built plays that could contain all of these contradictions without resolving them. I own Tony Tanner's Prefaces to Shakespeare, which is one of the best books of literary criticism I've ever read. Tanner approaches each play as a world, a complete self-contained world with its own rules, its own weather, its own moral atmosphere. And what he shows is that Shakespeare's genius was not just in the language, magnificent as the language is, but in the structure. Each play is a machine for thinking with. You enter it and your mind is rearranged. The question of how to live in Shakespeare is always particular. It's not how should a person live in the abstract. It's how should this person live in this situation with these constraints and these desires and these people around them. And the answer is always, it depends. It depends on who you are, where you are, what you love, what you fear. There is no universal formula. There is only the particular case and the courage to face it. Cervantes and Don Quixote. Don Quixote, published in 2 parts in 1605 and 1615, is the first modern novel. It's about a man who reads too many books about chivalry and goes mad. He puts on armor, mounts a broken down horse, and rides out to right wrongs, rescue maidens, and fight giants. The giants are windmills, the maidens are farm girls, the wrongs are imaginary. And Sancho Panza, his squire, follows him anyway, because even a delusion, if it's grand enough, is more interesting than the truth. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote in poverty, in prison, and in the aftermath of a life that included combat at the Battle of Lepanto, 5 years as a slave in Algiers, and repeated financial failures. He knew what the world was actually like. And he created a character who refused to accept it, who insisted against all evidence that the world could be better, that honor mattered, that beauty was worth fighting for, even if the fight was ridiculous. Don Quixote asks, is it better to see the world as it is or as it should be? Is the realist wiser than the idealist, or is the realist simply less brave? Cervantes doesn't answer. He lets the question stand. And 400 years later, it still stands. Every leader I've worked with faces this question. Every dreamer faces it. Every person who has ever believed in something that the evidence doesn't support faces it. And Cervantes' gift is not to resolve the tension, but to make it visible and funny and heartbreaking. Part 3. Part 3, the modern era, Dostoevsky. I've spent an entire narration on Dostoevsky elsewhere, so I'll be brief here, but his place in this history is essential. Dostoevsky is the writer who made the interior life, the full, unedited, uncensored interior life, the primary subject of fiction. Before Dostoevsky, novels were about what happened. After Dostoevsky, novels were about what it felt like. His answer to the question of how to live is the most difficult answer in this entire tradition. Through suffering, through love, through the refusal to accept easy answers. Dostoevsky believed that suffering was not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be faced, and that facing it honestly, without flinching, without rationalizing, without retreating into ideology, was the beginning of wisdom. He is the writer I return to most often. And he is the writer who frightens me most because he sees things about me that I would rather not see. That is his gift. That is his answer. Tolstoy. Tolstoy is Dostoevsky's great rival. And his answer to the question of how to live is almost the opposite. Where Dostoevsky is interior, Tolstoy is exterior. Where Dostoevsky puts you inside one consciousness, Tolstoy shows you the whole landscape. War and peace is the world seen from above. History as a force that moves through individuals without their knowledge or consent. Anna Karenina is society as a living organism, in which every marriage, every affair, every dinner party is connected to every other. But Tolstoy's answer to the question is simpler than Dostoevsky's, and in some ways more radical. Tolstoy believed that the answer was love, not romantic love. He's too honest about the destructiveness of romantic love for that, but a kind of active daily love, the love of the farmer Levin in Anna Karenina, who finds meaning not in philosophy or society or art, but in the simple act of mowing a field alongside his peasants, in the rhythm of physical work, in the awareness of being alive in a body on a particular morning with the sun on your back and the scythe in your hands. Tolstoy's later life was a catastrophe of conviction. He renounced his earlier novels. He gave away his property. He tried to live as a peasant. His marriage to Sophia, which had been the foundation of his work, collapsed into mutual recrimination. He fled his home at the age of 82 and died at a train station surrounded by journalists and followers. The man who wrote the most comprehensive portrait of life in all of literature couldn't figure out how to live his own. Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf changed what the novel could do. Before Woolf, the novel moved through time in a roughly linear way. This happened, then that happened, then the other thing. Woolf dissolved that linearity. In Mrs. Dalloway, a single day in London contains an entire life. In To the Lighthouse, a 10-year gap is compressed into a section called Time Passes that is only a few dozen pages long. In The Waves, 6 characters speak in monologues that are more like music, then prose, rhythmic, patterned, building toward crescendos of feeling that have no equivalent in earlier fiction. Woolf's answer to the question of how to live is pay attention. Pay attention to the quality of light in a room. Pay attention to the sound of a door closing. Pay attention to the moment, this moment right now, because it will not come again, and it contains everything you need. Woolf is the novelist of the present tense, of the luminous particular, of the ordinary Tuesday afternoon that, experienced with sufficient attention, reveals itself to be extraordinary. She suffered from severe mental illness all her life. She heard voices. She had breakdowns that lasted months. She killed herself in 1941 walking into the River Ouse with stones in her pockets. And there is something in her fiction that reflects this extremity, a quality of attention so intense that it becomes almost painful, as if the beauty of the world is too much to bear. Woolf paid attention the way Dostoevsky suffered, without protection, and her prose is the record of that unprotected encounter with reality. Kafka and Faulkner. Kafka and Faulkner are paired here not because they're similar, they could hardly be more different, but because they represent two essential modern responses to the question of how to live. Kafka's answer is, you can't. The system is too large, the guilt is too deep, the gap between who you are and who the world requires you to be is unbridgeable. Kafka is the poet of entrapment, of the impossibility of escape, of the morning when you wake up and discover that you have become something you don't recognize. Faulkner's answer is you endure. The past is never dead, it's not even past. History is a weight that presses on every living person, and the only response is to carry it. Faulkner's characters, the Compsons, the Snopeses, the Sutpens, are crushed by the past, by the legacy of slavery and war and family dysfunction that they cannot escape and cannot undo. But they endure, they go on, and in their endurance, Faulkner finds a kind of nobility that is inseparable from suffering. Both answers are incomplete. Kafka's despair can become a prison of its own. Faulkner's endurance can become a mask for resignation. But together, they describe the territory of modern life, trapped and enduring, guilty and carrying on, unable to escape the system and unwilling to stop trying. To Borges. Jorge Luis Borges never wrote a novel. He wrote short stories, most of them under 10 pages long, that contain more ideas than most novels contain in 500. He wrote about labyrinths, about infinite libraries, about men who dream other men into existence, about a memory so perfect that it becomes a curse. Borges's answer to the question of how to live is the most unexpected in this tradition. Through the imagination, the world is a text. Reality is a story we tell ourselves, and the most truthful thing we can do is acknowledge the fictional nature of our existence and embrace it. Not despairingly, Borges is never despairing, but with a kind of intellectual joy. The labyrinth is terrifying, yes, but it is also beautiful. And the fact that we can conceive of the labyrinth, even if we can never escape it, is itself a form of freedom. I keep Borges Ficciones on my shelf, and I read one story every few months, the way some people read Psalms. Each story is a small, perfect machine that rearranges how you think about reality. And the cumulative effect of reading Borges over years is a kind of intellectual liberation. The realization that the boundaries you thought were real between truth and fiction, between self and other, between the book and the reader, are not as solid as you believed. Cormac McCarthy, I've written an entire script about Blood Meridian and what McCarthy teaches about power, so I won't repeat that here. But McCarthy's place in this tradition is specific and important. He is the American writer who took the question of how to live and set it in the most extreme landscape possible: the desert, the border, the place where civilization ends and something older begins. McCarthy's answer, if he has one, is that the question itself is a luxury. The judge in Blood Meridian doesn't ask how to live. He lives, he asserts, he dominates. The question of how to live implies that you have a choice, that moral deliberation is possible, that the universe is the kind of place where values matter. McCarthy's fiction challenges that assumption, not because McCarthy is a nihilist. He's too interested in the beauty of the world to be a nihilist, but because he understands that the universe is indifferent to human values and that any answer to the question of how to live must begin with that indifference. Reading McCarthy after Montaigne, after Marcus Aurelius, after Dante, is like walking out of a cathedral into a desert. The architecture is gone. The moral order is gone. And what remains is the landscape, the light, and the human being alone trying to figure out what to do next. David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace is the last writer in this tradition. The last because he is the most recent, and because his work represents, to me, the current state of the question. Wallace understood that the great enemy of meaningful life in the 21st century is not suffering. Dostoevsky covered that. It's not bureaucracy. Kafka covered that. It's not the indifference of the universe. McCarthy covered that. The great enemy is distraction, the inability to pay attention, the constant, frictionless availability of entertainment, information, stimulation, the tsunami of input that makes it almost impossible to sit with a single thought, a single feeling, a single moment long enough to experience it fully. Wallace's answer to the question, given most concisely in his Kenyan commencement speech, known as "This is water," is essentially Father Zosima's answer, translated into contemporary American English. Choose what you pay attention to. The default setting of human consciousness is self-centeredness. Every experience is filtered through the question, what does this mean for me? And the discipline of a meaningful life is learning to override that default, to see the other person in the grocery store line, to notice the sunset, to be present in the boring, mundane Tuesday afternoon moments that constitute the actual substance of existence. Wallace died by suicide in 2008. He was 46, and his unfinished novel, The Pale King, was about boredom, about the heroism of paying attention to tedious, repetitive work. He couldn't finish it. He couldn't maintain in his own life the attention he preached. And there is something in that failure, the failure for the most brilliant mind of his generation to practice what he knew. That is itself a final, devastating answer to the question of how to live. The answer is with difficulty, with failure, with the knowledge that the attention you need is harder to sustain than you thought, and that the default setting is always pulling you back, and that the effort is worth making even though you will never fully succeed. That's where we are. 3,000 years after Homer, we're still trying to get home. The monsters are different. The seas are different, but the question is the same. How do you remain yourself in a world that keeps trying to turn you into something else? I don't have the answer, but I have the books. And the books, taken together, Homer and Plato, Marcus Aurelius and Dante, Montaigne and Shakespeare, Dostoevsky and Woolf, Kafka and Borges, McCarthy and Wallace, constitute the best map we have of the territory. Thank you for walking through it with me. I'll see you next time.